dissemination itself is not something that I've it's not let's say a specific point of focus or something that's drawn me into this space, as you said. Um, I mean, I think it's fundamental to a lot of the work that I do. But I think, what I am drawn to most in kind of editorial practice is collaboration, right? And I think if I was maybe interested in dissemination proper, I think that there's actually like there's a lot of very experimental things that can be done with that. There's a lot of let's say it's the thing about publication and dissemination is that kind of anyone can do it. It's just a question about kind of infrastructural reach. But I mean, for me, I guess what's drawn me into these spaces of dissemination is a is a deeply kind of rooted desire to work with people and to collaborate. And that's really what I see is to be the foundation of editorial practice. It's like, yes, it is about putting ideas out there, but the process of doing that for me is one that is it's actually very intimate, right? And it's about the work that different people do around a single kind of set of ideas or let's say a work.
But okay, so if you say collaboration, then I wonder why collaboration or to what extent? Because I guess everyone's in some ways collaborating. To build a building, you need to collaborate with a contractor, with a client.
Mhm.
But there are kind of limits, there are boundaries to that collaboration. So I wonder whether you see it as a kind of I need to collaborate within the space that I'm interested in, or I actually don't want to have space. Like which side of that coin is something that you're drawn to?
I think I like being invited into spaces
Mhm.
in that sense, right? You're right, like collaboration is fundamental to life, right? To kind of everything. But I think it's really about the scope of collaboration. And, when you collaborate on a building, buildings are something that take hundreds of people, the collaboration over, many months, if not years. Whereas if you publish a text or let's say some sort of essay or some sort of publication, it's really a collaboration between two people, right? So this is where I mean that the collaborations that that the way that I see editing or editorial practice as a practice of collaboration, it's a very intimate one. Um, and I mean, and I mean, I think you touched upon something about like, do I want to be out of the space? Do I want to not have a space? It's a, it's an important thing to reflect on, and it's something that I think as an editor, it's something sometimes I kind of ignore or forget, and other times it comes maybe more back in the focus because almost by definition, to be an editor is not to be an author.
Mhm.
Authors are the people that editors collaborate with. Um, but let me maybe kind of take one step back and maybe explain like it's not necessarily why I became an editor,
Mhm.
but or how, but it's a little bit like an origin story. Um,
Uh-huh.
so when I graduated architecture school, I studied philosophy as well, and so I always was interested in kind of in thinking about architecture and understanding what can be thought through the lens of architecture. And so I was writing, but I was never a good writer, or I didn't feel like I was a good writer. And I know maybe most people don't think they're good writers, even though they might be, but but I still was writing. I felt like I had something I wanted to express and I wanted to get out. But I think very importantly, I knew that I myself did not know the way to express it in the best way. Right. So at that time, this was kind of the moment of like the Archazines era. There were a lot of independent publications going on. And I started, publishing with a number of different ones. I submitted projects, I submitted essays, and I was really thankful for the opportunity to publish in these journals. Um, but I would say 98% of the time, I would send a text and it would immediately go into print. There would be no feedback. There would be no dialogue. There would be no engagement with what I had actually written. Um, and so along the way, as I started writing more and more, I started getting to know editors, and eventually they started asking me like, "Hey, would you want to try doing this?" Because they just needed some help. Um, but if I have to kind of sum it up, it's I feel like I became an editor because I was a writer who was looking for one and didn't
Mm.
wasn't able to find one. Um, and so, you know, but that also I think explains in a way what I mean by collaboration. I personally think that no one really knows how to express what they want to express in the best of all ways. Or maybe they do, but it doesn't mean that it can't be improved. It can't be
Yeah.
refined without the involvement and the input and the collaboration of someone else. So when I and of course that entire kind of relation, it's one that's founded upon respect, right? But it's also founded on a degree of humility, right?
Mm.
That like, yes, this is what I'm trying to say, and maybe this is not the best way it can possibly be done. So when I edit text and when I work with people in an editorial capacity, um, there are all these different kind of like terms for types of editing, right? There's copy editing, there's line editing, there's developmental editing. It's always
Mhm.
very difficult for me to position myself within that because I feel like I do all of them at once. Because for me, it's really a question about how ideas are expressed, how stories are told, how narratives are constructed. It's really a question of rhetoric. Um, and so, I remember there's this one lecture that Tom Weaver gave at Columbia once. The video is online where he really like kind of shows what his editorial process is like. But I don't want to say that necessarily what I do is something similar to what he does or did at the AA files at that time. But it's like I take a very hands-on approach. Like you know, I really treat words like bricks, and they'll get moved around, they'll get shuffled, they'll get deleted, things will get added. And so that's and it's not to say that like you know every text that I edit and that I publish, it's important to make sure that it is still the author's, right? Because again, the editor is not the author. So there's always a kind of balance, or there's always a line that needs to be seen of like what is
Mm.
the author's voice, what is the author trying to say, and then how can the editor kind of you know contribute to that, add to that, ask questions that will, I don't know, stimulate kind of further thinking and development of the piece.
I mean, that really resonates with me in exactly in the way that you're describing it, because there's almost an inherent conversation in it. So you say, of course, the important thing is humility, respect, but I guess there is also this willingness to just be in dialogue, or actually curiosity maybe as well.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, no, I mean it requires a kind of insatiable curiosity because, if you really do this, I'll maybe, let's say on a good day, I'll kind of go through maybe four different texts, and those four different texts or five different texts, whatever it is, they might be from completely different projects, from completely different thematics, and so you actually need to be able to just like jump from one idea to the next, to the next, to the next. And yeah, maybe that requires a degree of curiosity just to learn because it's also like we don't know everything. There's always more to learn.
So, but then you say you became the editor. I also connect to that because, in a way, I often describe becoming a teacher is that
Mm.
I often say to my students that I wanted to become the teacher that I was looking for.
Mm.
Uh, of course, you embody so many things that you learn from the people that you look up to, but you also try to correct their mistakes or certain things that you thought were not done in a way that maybe would have been more productive.
Mm.
So have you had that? You don't need to mention any names, but I wonder, well, you actually said it that these articles and texts would just get published. But I guess it's very clear what you learn there, and that is to engage in a conversation. I wonder if there are any good things you learned from any editors. You mentioned Tom Weaver, but what is it? What is it that you learned? Um,
Mm.
what are the lessons that you can then work with, and then maybe adapt and change and transform?
Mm. Well, so it's interesting. I mean, I think, as I became like I've been editing for maybe I mean over 10 years now, right? E-flux turns 10 next year, and I was at Volume before that, and I was doing some smaller editorial work before that. But as I became an editor, I think what drew me there was the practice of editing, but what I learned was dissemination, right?
Mm,
And so with that's I think what I learned, because I mean I feel like editorial practice, um it's a very embodied practice, and I really do speak about it as a practice, not in the way that architects speak about practice, but more in the way that artists speak about practice. Like, what does it mean to have an artistic practice within oneself? It's something you do regularly. It's an engagement with materials, and it's um so I kind of learned about myself, I guess, through this along the way. But yeah, by being able to do this, you are, let's say, essentially positioned within infrastructures of
mm,
publicity and dissemination.
mhm,
And so there I learned I mean, I think I learned a lot. I mean, when I started out writing, I was happy to just kind of write for anyone. I didn't really, it's not to say that I didn't respect the people that I was writing for, but what I mean is, like, I was writing for like independent, architectural theory journals. I was writing for like trade magazines, like all different types of things. So I think I very quickly learned about like the landscape of publishing and how vast it is.
mm,
And I think I learned how to, like, where I wanted to position myself within that. And so, like, there at that point, now, this is in the wake of 2008, the financial crisis. So there was a lot of discourse around like critical spatial practice at the time. Like the work of DPR Barcelona, Marcus Meeson, was very like it was clear to me that like that's what resonated with me. But it's still this question of like, once you start embedding yourself, within this kind of editorial practice, and within, let's say, a sphere of disciplinary practice, right? It's like, what do you, yeah, what do you do with that? So, I guess what I learned was like where I wanted to be,
mm,
in terms of like a field of interest. But then, as I grew kind of into this, I started to learn more the way that the industry works.
mhm,
The way, so I learned about like what trade magazines are, who they're for, what their business models are. This was also the rise, the era of the rise of Arc Daily and these things. So, I saw kind of how these different business models worked. I was also, at the time, it was a very, this was, I basically got my main start at Volume, right?
mhm,
So this was after Brendan Cormier left. I was brought in, and it was a very strange time for the magazine, because
mhm,
this was also when Mark Wigley left Columbia, which, who was the founding editor and a structural partner of Volume, and Amal Andraus became the dean. Um, she came in and severed the relationship to Volume, which I'm not criticizing her for. She wanted to start her own stuff. She started the Avery Review and all these other things. But the Volume has a curious history, right? Where Volume was effectively founded um, after Arcus was kicked out of the New Institute, in a way,
mm,
right? So where they lost like their structural funding, or sorry, not the New Institute, the NAE, the Netherlands Architecture Institute. Um, so Volume was a collaboration between, Arcus, this now independent publishing editorial agency, AMO, um, which at that point, or no, and Columbia through C Lab. primarily. Um, and so, when Columbia left volume, it basically just like cut out the economic foundation of that of volume. And they have been rebuilding themselves over the years, and I'm really impressed by the stuff that Stefan Peterman is doing there as their new directorship. I think it's very important that they have reestablished a connection with the new institute. But that was really my first engagement, like starting to understand the more infrastructural side of publishing, the economic side, but also the distribution side. Volume sells for 20 euros.
Hmm.
I think 14 of that goes to the distributor, right? So like 75% of the retail price of a magazine goes just towards the distributor, at least in that model. Maybe other places have it differently. But that was a really interesting thing, So it was a question about getting subscriptions, but also subscriptions were like, they only paid so much because of distribution costs. Um, so yeah, that was definitely like my first engagement with like the realities of what it actually made, takes to maintain a publication. Then while I was working for Volume, I got approached for e-flux, and there the question, that I don't want to say that that necessarily advanced my thinking about like infrastructure, dissemination, economy, and all of this, but it at least showed me a model that was like very well designed and worked perfectly. Um, so,
But that was also the very, very early stage of its kind of life.
well, no, so that's the thing. Like, eFlux has been around since 1999.
Hmm.
And it's built up a community, it's built up a technical infrastructure, it's built up a workforce since then, but it's built up an audience since then. When we started in 2016, we literally just piggybacked on that. And of
Hmm.
course, we were doing our own thing, but we literally built on
On the
and
existing.
worked with all of the infrastructure that eFlux had, and we are still reliant on that. I mean, that's what makes us a part of eFlux. Right.
I think I was telling you about or at least we were talking about the publishing forum that I just organized at the AA this summer. I guess the different things you're talking about were very much mentioned by different, I guess, by different people. Um, we had editors of printed magazines like Dejan Sujic, who was the editor of Blueprint for many years and founder, I believe. Two people like Tom Ravenscroft, that's the editor of the zine.
Mhm.
And I think that the question of economic models is absolutely central. And I think they both of those characters that I just mentioned by chance had both started their careers in trades magazines. But in both of those examples, and actually across the board, there was a strong sense that the kind of culture of architectural publishing was very broad and very wide. But there is, to me, a sense of certain kind of convergence that's happening. And I don't know whether maybe if you look at where you started and where we are now, you can also acknowledge certain kind of convergence or certain kind of narrowing of discourse, or at least narrowing of how things are done, or actually what it is that we're discussing in these publications. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I'm trying not to be very specific
yeah,
in
yeah.
or judgmental, but yeah.
Well, no, so I think that there has been. I mean, it's an interesting point. Over the summer, I read this new book by Aaron Kayer,
Hmm.
who's a scholar out of LA. The book is based on his PhD, um, and he within this book, like in the introductory framing, he mentioned something that I don't know that just kind of like blew my mind in the simplicity, but also how far it resonates. Which, what he was saying is that architecture historically is a profession. Within the United States, a profession is a type of economic entity. it is not a business. It is also not a trade. So business, profession, and trade are all three completely different types of
Mhm.
economic entities. Um, at the same time, so he recently wrote a text in Harvard Design Magazine about the relationship between the profession and the discipline. Now, this is not necessarily theory and practice, but the profession and the discipline is, something that maybe when I was growing up, I would like to think that those two things were really held apart and they were kind of, at least, the discipline, which is where I situate myself quite, firmly, was kind of okay not being related to the profession, because if anything, the discipline that I felt myself to be a part of was dedicated towards developing new professions effectively, right? It was about creating new forms of spatial practice. It was about like taking architecture and bringing it into new directions. Um, Over the past 10 years, that kind of, I do think that there has been, let's say, maybe a reconvergence from the discipline with more practical matters. Um, you know, uh, you know, and I think that this can maybe be um, evidenced, like by the architectural review and how that's been taken. I think that there's been a lot of um, I think concern about climate change like ultimately comes down to one of professional practice. So I think that that's done something quite interesting. I remember when I was giving a talk, like the annual lecture at the Lena platform in Copenhagen. Um, Somebody came up to me who was working at Luma Arls, who's been like pioneers in bio-based regional plant based building. And he asked me a question. He was like, so you're talking about all of this like, sustainability stuff, but like, do you think any of it is actually like discursively interesting? And I kind of had to answer like, uh, no. But that doesn't mean it's not important. Um,
Mhm.
and so um, I don't know. I don't know if that entirely kind of addresses your question, but
Well, I think what you're pointing at is a thematic convergence. What I'm really just thinking is, for example, about Dezeen or Arc Daily being these central places where people go and look at something. Or I guess the argument for I guess Instagram algorithm is that it actually is tailored to your personal interests. So,
but by convergence, do you mean like monopolization? Right? Like, yeah, Arc Daily has certainly like monopolized a type of publication, right? Um,
mhm.
I don't, so maybe it's a kind of semantic question, but when it comes to convergence, I think that there's an enormous kind of polyphony of discourses and practices that are taking shape today. And so I think that polyphony is something that should be nurtured, right? I don't think it should be kind of flattened into one. And I think, what we at eFlux, I think we almost try and do is it's not that we try and be shapeshifters, but we try and, you know, uh, provide space for like different spheres of practice, different ways of understanding, architectural discourse and theory and to represent itself. So, in a way, uh, I don't know if there's been a convergence in discourse or the discipline, but there's definitely been like infrastructural monopolization, or but that I think is almost just like a almost an inevitability. It maybe it's not an inevitability, but it feels like an inevitability, but that could just be because of the, like the stage of capitalism that we are currently living in, where the only way to survive is by monopolizing and becoming, let's say, the one platform to rule them all.
Yes, and then I guess I wonder then in that context, I mean, you say the institution, let's say that you represent, I guess eFlux could also be seen as an institution in certain ways. You have to have an active focus on kind of diversification of voices, let's say, or you need to actively be uh, seeking to expand a certain conversation. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking of, let's say, the Harvard, the $100,000 scholarship, wheelwright, and how actually there seems to be a certain pattern that it's like material extraction. It's like in this sort of which is also fine. I mean, an institution is very much allowed to devise a certain taste for research or so on.
Well, I mean, it's curious. I mean, the wheelwright in particular. I mean, it's also just been like dominated by the RCA for a very long time, right? I mean, the RCA has had like, five of the past seven winners or something. And I know Adrian was involved to some degree on the board, but or on the jury, but certainly not for all of them. Um, yeah, I don't know. I think the wheelwright is interesting because it's a little bit like the Pritzker, right? It like has at least maybe what the Pritzker used to be. Um,
Mhm,
it has this kind of incredible reputation. Um, and the wheelwright used to be just eligible for GSD grads. And then it opened itself, and so maybe it's also kind of like finding its place. But I mean, so but I think I see what you're saying. Like um there is this question. There does seem to be a kind of um consensus, that let's say the material consequences and implications of architecture are unavoidable, and that that is something that we should not ignore.
mhm,
There's not so there's you could almost say that there's like a seriousness
mhm,
to it, right? I mean, you don't um let's say the space for conjecture, for let's say wild speculativity or speculation, it's certainly not something you see in those types of spaces. I think as a whole, the question, I would say the role of like projectivity, right, and speculation within architecture, it is being kind of radically rethought. And it's yeah, not like it was when I was growing up, let's say.
because I think what it does, it then perpetuates its own mode of, let's say, communicating.
Mm.
Because then what you'll get once you've done supported three of these kinds of research projects, then all the research projects that are going to be coming to you will kind of be starting to feel similar, and then you'll probably, because you've developed a taste, you'll be then perpetuating that kind of taste of
Mm.
project. And yeah, it's just
Yeah, I mean it's tricky, I think at e-flux, I mean, we have like various reputations, and we also have we represent various communities and audiences. And so, when we collaborate with people, we bring a certain kind of approach, but we also sometimes just bring, as I don't want to say we bring a set of authors, right? Because I mean, yes, there have been people that we've worked with a number of times over the years. But we bring, let's say, a kind of community of discourse that sometimes we, bring into projects. Um, but I don't know. I think that it is uh for something like the wheelwright, or like schools of architecture, they have, their mandates are very different than a publication, right?
mhm,
Um
mhm,
our mandate, if I have to like try and synthesize it, it's just to, to represent and to showcase, let's say, like cutting edge architectural discourse, and to continue actively expanding the relevance of the discipline, and the knowledge that is produced from it. But there's it's a very different question when you start thinking about schools, and you start thinking about what is required to give to these to these students, right? Because then there's a kind of there's almost like an inherent um dialogue and almost compromise with the reality as it exists, right?
But yes, and then so if you then go back to this question of editor, I guess editor also develops a taste, and then a publication also develops a taste, their own taste, but also the taste of the publication. So then it's interesting in the last two conversations that I've had, and actually they haven't been published, but one is with Eddie Heathcote, who is the architecture critic at the Financial Times, and the other one is with Jeremy Leslie, who's the founder of Mad Culture. Um, it was Eddie who mentioned we started talking about gatekeeping, and in fact, I think again to Eddie, I mentioned a point that Tom Ravenscroft made at the our Publishing Architecture Forum, that the zine was founded as a response to, let's say, gatekeeping in architectural publishing. To which Eddie said, well, actually, we probably need more gatekeeping than we have. And actually, there is a value to gatekeeping. And then Jeremy totally agreed with Eddie, like a couple of weeks later when I spoke to him. Um, and I just thought, oh, this is so interesting. I mean, we obviously associate gatekeeping with something that is obviously terrible, but then there is a question of taste, a question of editing or editorial stance, and yeah, I wonder how do you think about that, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I maybe this isn't the best way to like start answering that question, but I consider myself a relatively like selfish editor.
Mhm.
Like I commission things that I want to read. And I'm not the only commissioner, but because of the collaborative model that we have. Um, but you know, when it comes to gatekeeping, a lot of people get in touch with me, and they want to propose certain essays to be written. Um, you know, I don't know, a lot of them, if I have to be perfectly honest, a lot of them are just not particularly relevant or interesting to what we are doing. I know what it's like to be an author who just sends, their pitch to 10 different publications. And when I was doing that, I even got responses from some editors being like, "Hey, if you actually like know what we do, you'll know that this is not suitable."
Mhm.
But there's a lot of, there's a lot of people who, I mean, I'd say we align ourselves, or I align myself, or e-flux aligns itself with a kind of, with like almost a para-academic discourse, right? We draw a lot from academia. Um, and by academia, I also mean like doctoral level study academia. We're not an academic journal, but I think we um work with, and or let's say we have a certain set of standards that are very similar to academic publishing, in the sense that like you can't just say something. You need to not just back up what you say, you need to ground it in something like tangible and something specific. And so there's a lot of, I think gatekeeping can often be invoked by people who are just angry that they are not publishing anywhere. So people who invoke that as a critical term, saying I'm being like kept out, that can kind of also represent a sense of entitlement, right? Um, but I don't know. For me, we have another kind of like mechanism for this. Everything that virtually everything that we publish, um, needs to, at eFlux, it needs to fit within a thematic context that is also one that is done, that is created in collaboration with institutional partners, right? So, when someone sends me a pitch or something, um, the one question that I always ask myself is like, is this good enough? Right? Like I'm not afraid to, at least say to myself, like, no, sorry, this is not good enough. but is it substantiated enough? Does it engage seriously enough? Has there been actual research done, right? Or is it just kind of, a vibes-based reading of the discipline as a whole, right? Like that isn't something that we're really interested in. Maybe other places are, but that's not what our audience also is interested in. Um, but so if the thing is good enough, then I need to see, like, does this fit within a project that we have ongoing? Our economic logic is one that is based on collaboration. And then, if it does, then I still need to kind of propose that to other people, right? And so, like gatekeeping, it's not even I think it's a complicated term and concept because it's like gate. I'm trying to create a like an analogy, right? If let's say dissemination is a stream, right? Let's say it's a pipe.
Mhm.
Like the pipe is always going to be determined by a certain, dimension and materiality. Um, and, there's going to be some sort of modulation of the flow, right? Like there's always going to be some degree of control when you are in a position of of publication, right? Of making works public in any form, whether that's curating, whether that's editing or something else. So I think that there's always going to be some degree of that. And I think, this comment that Eddie made of like maybe we need more gatekeeping, that also might be in response to this kind of like, Web 2.0, very rosy, idealistic ideal, with Dazine and with ArcDaily and all of these platforms that are just like, oh, let's show everything. Um, but I think it's really, I think certain things should be gate kept. Um, and it's a question of like how do you do that? On eFlux, I mainly work on the editorial side of things, the projects, the publications, but we also do announcements. Those announcements, you know, we don't turn many people down, if at all. I don't, it's very, very rare. But one of the main barriers is there's a barrier of entry, right? It's a pay to play system basically, for the announcements. So, and this is something, of course, that gets, if anything, so like what we do in on the announcements is like we set the gate. And then if there's someone we really want in, then we'll kind of find ways of opening it. But I don't know, like does there need to be more gatekeeping? I don't know if there needs to be more or less. I just think that there needs to maybe be a more conscious, acknowledgement of the fact that like we are gatekeepers, right? Like there like we I don't know that we make choices to involve some people and not others, right? We cannot, do everyone. So we also just need to like position ourselves a little bit more clearly. And if, a call towards more gatekeeping is a way to, empower and encourage people to do that, then sure.
I guess it's actually a way of creating space. What you're doing is, I mean, I'll be in a week or two, I'll be interviewing students that might want to come into my design studio at the AA. I mean, the AA system is quite brutal in the sense that as a teacher, you actually interview the student and then you let them in or not. And of course, it sounds horrible. We're not really assessing students as if we like them or not. It's actually the question is like, are you the right person for this kind of brief or for this kind of line of inquiry? Or have you understood it? Have you misunderstood it? And therefore, yeah, absolutely, that's where that makes complete sense. And then you are creating a space, no? You're actually creating a space.
I mean, I just think you're definitely, you are creating a space and you're maintaining the quality within that. It's like it's you know like you're basically like you're steering a boat, and if there are too many people on the boat, it will sink, right? And that's not to say we need to keep people out, but there are also this is something I have to tell students, because part of our education, it's students are expected to go on an internship, right? and to tell students like, hey, if someone says no, and it's the same with publications as well, people trying to write, if someone says no, it's not because of you, right? Or like chances are it's not because of you. It's just because like they may not have an opening then, or they may not need someone with the skills that you have. And so it's not personal in that sense. Or maybe it is personal, but it's also it's not like they hate you, right? It's just like it's just not the
But it's
person.
no, but it's the right decision. You wouldn't be yourself in that environment. Like that is not an environment where maybe you should be. I mean, it's
Totally, totally. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
um but then okay, I mean this is actually I wasn't even didn't even think that we would talk about this. That's how these go. But I guess maybe the question we could turn it back to architecture.
Sure.
We spoke so much about editing and the editorial process and so on, but really you're an architect or to a certain extent engaged in the discipline. And I wonder, with that constant flow of information, as an editor, it's a privileged position because it's a bit like being in an academic post, which you're also in. You're constantly ideas are flowing, and you're there being able to every time kind of check in and see what those ideas are and what the discourse is. Um, and as such, I wonder, how do you see the profession? I guess we did speak about thematic areas that seem to dominate the field. And also we touched on the kind of expansiveness that is also a pluralistic space. It's not singular. Um, but I wonder whether there are any overarching critical points, or whether there are any critical points that you think might define the field in the next 10 years or, or are defining the field now, and what that may mean for the field and the profession.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is somewhat difficult to speak at that level because I do think things are very different in England as opposed to the Netherlands, as opposed to the United States, as opposed to, to South Africa, as opposed to Indonesia, right? I mean, it's very wide. I think, from what I'm what I have been kind of seeing, I guess, a couple things kind of come to mind. It's like there are people who are kind of recognizing the limits to architecture, and are just kind of taking those skills and doing something else. And they're not even necessarily trying to hold on to a, they're not necessarily even taking on the disciplinary project. They're not even saying, "Hey, I'm doing this other thing, but it's also architecture." They're just like, "No, I'm just doing something else." Right? But I think, there's at the same time, I think in a lot of countries, the United States, at least New York, was maybe a bit of a pioneer in this just because of its like proximity to capital and real estate, is just like how the different kind of business models of architecture. In the Netherlands, there's a recent trend that is being like really lauded and everybody's super happy about it, which the let's say the architect developer collaboration is kind of a new thing here. Um, and that I think is a very it's a very dangerous conceit that is taken because I think it loses sight of or let's say it places an undue amount of faith in, let's say, the regulatory bodies to maintain the let's say the professional, let's say, the ethics and the integrity of the profession, which I think can very easily get lost even in a place like the Netherlands. Um, but, alongside all of this, there is, because of, let's say, the economic pressures on the profession, and let's say the ever increasing technologization of architectural labor, a lot of people are just forced to look for other things. So people are going into video games, people are going into film. So what I do think is, um, I don't know if this is still happening at the AA or at the GSD or these places. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I have always told my students that, the skills that you learn here are useful for many, many, many things. Right? Because the school where I teach, a lot of students go there and they're like, I'm interested in architecture, but I definitely don't want to be an architect, right? And they're kind of concerned, like, is it worth my time to be here? Um, so I think, this question of like what good is architecture without architecture, you could say, let's say, I think is an important kind of reckoning point. On the other hand, I do think that what I see a lot of is like relatively small scale um, like independent practices that are engaging with a lot of, let's say, material experimentation, and looking at, say, like bio-based building. Um, and, I think it's also maybe reconfiguring, the scope of like what we expect of people, right? Of people within our profession, within our discipline. Um, maybe this model of like the mega practice. And I mean, there's a lot of even big practices that are like, no, we don't want to be that big. We intentionally, stay at 10 to 20 people or something. Um, but but no,
Which still takes an immense, it which still takes an immense amount of energy to maintain
like,
practice.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Even at any scale, right? Um, I mean, what always kind of made me feel in a kind of way that I'm not really sure how to understand is like basically every town in the world has an architect. There is something to architecture that like there's a reason why it's licensed in a similar way to like law and medicine. It is kind of just like an essential service, not in the COVID sense, not on a daily sense, but to for society to run, architecture is necessary. Whether all of that necessity is entirely encompassed by the profession of architecture these days and has not been kind of siphoned off to construction or real estate or those things, that's a different question. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think one thing um which I wish I maybe had more of an idea of when I was going into school, is really just kind of architects' relationship to capital, and like what it actually takes to start a practice, what it actually takes to build something, or not what it takes to build something, but like what it takes to build a practice. Um, you know, I remember Joshua Prince Ramus, said at some point, I don't know this, I remember this from like 15, 20 years ago, that like architecture is so much about rhetoric, right? And that every architect should be required to take a class in rhetorics. And I'm not sure that's entirely true, but like I wish that there was a bit more of an understanding, at least based on my own kind of education, of like what it takes to have a practice, like how to get a job, right? I don't mean like work for another architect, but what it takes to get someone to pay you to be an architect, to build something, right? Those
Absolutely.
more kind of minutia workings are actually fundamental.
I mean, last year there was a point where I was thinking, well, architects should also be taught investing and not necessarily buying stocks, but actually what it means to invest. So the programs that I was running this summer, they were like, that they had to be paid by the participants. And it was amazing how many people were there really actively investing in their education. Most of them are, practicing architects or publishers or so on. But this notion that you also have to invest is really, I think really interesting.
No, I think it's a really interesting point. But I also wonder, yeah, like to understand what is an investment and what is not in that sense. I mean, I'm also reflecting on this kind of personally in terms of where I am now. Like, I mean, an investment is something that pays off later,
Absolutely.
right? So it's like, what does it mean to, let's say, plant seeds that you don't necessarily know where it's going to go? And so almost in a sense, I would say that like a job, right, is like not an investment.
Oh yeah.
in a weird way. It's like doing these kind of, these like summer schools, these intensives, like that, those types of things are real investments, almost because I think what they do is they throw you off course, right? Or they introduce a different perspective to you and it completely changes your outlook on like, what you might do and who you might become, right? Yeah, and I think that's super important. But that to me, that to me is also it's not necessarily maybe the way to teach that is not necessarily about investment, but just about like personal development, right? Like what it actually means to have a career and to develop a career within a field. Yeah, investment is fundamental to that.
And I guess we get lost in architectural education in a way, because I guess obviously education is a form of investment. You know, you are investing by studying it for 5 years. You are investing in your. I need something else. I didn't quite get everything I need in these 5 years, and I think that's always a reckoning point that actually you now perhaps know what you actually need or what else you need, and therefore then you can go and get that.
Yeah, I mean, there's always, and I mean, there's been a lot of work recently done on this, how like everything has become gambling, there's a subtle difference between a gamble and a bet, or sorry, a bet and an investment.
Yeah.
Um, but that's also the thing, like certain investments pay off better than others, right? And some pay off immediately, some pay off later, and some don't pay off at all, right? Um, and yeah, but still, I think it's about this idea. I think that there's a certain understanding of the self that is required to be able to see one's life in those terms. Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing that actually now you're again, I'm reminded of Lars Muller, who came to the AA, and he said about 5 times, he said, everything I've ever done was to invest in my own independence.
Mhm.
And he said, many of my investments fell through, like many books that he invested immense amounts of money didn't sell, but then some really did. And he's like, I've got there a pile of Zumthor works, and then I think the Herzog and de Meuron um, something nature book. He's kind of jokingly saying that those few books might get him through his retirement.
Yeah, but what's funny, I just want to mention about Lars, like I've never really gone into publishing myself independently. I mean, I do a lot of independent book projects, but um, Lars is a graphic designer, and that actually allows there's a kind of genre of publishers that are actually graphic designers, right? There's a number here in Amsterdam. There's Building Fictions. There's Roma. There's a lot of them basically. Actually, Roma might not be. Um, but I think that also allows the reason I bring this up is like he was maybe allowed to invest in his own independence in ways that other people might not be because they don't have these like multiple I mean we all have multiple skills within but as a graphic designer who wants to be a publisher like a lot of independence is already there like one crucial person in the entire process the graphic designer is also the publisher so you just kind of take out a lot of variables right sorry but I just wanted to
No, that's super smart. So I think if an architect could start thinking in a similar way, so maybe that's where this merging or connecting to developer comes as a
yeah.
maybe.
Yeah, no, I think it is. I really think it is. It's a way of reducing risk, right?
Yeah, yeah. Nick, I've just come back from Venice, and I saw the Venice Biennale. Congratulations on the book. That's like a an insane project.
Yeah.
But it's another, I guess it's another way in which you're able to survey what's going on. And so how was that experience?
That experience was wild.
Looks wild.
Yeah. I mean, I have to say, I was invited, or let's say I put myself forward, for that project, knowing that it would be I would be immersing myself in a context and in a world that I am not familiar with and that I don't really belong in. And that was one of the reasons why I did it, because I thought it would give me this overview of the field, which is not the overview, it's not the only perspective, but it would expose me to an aspect of the discipline and the profession that I wouldn't really have been able to otherwise, at least not to that extent. Um, but so in that sense, in terms of like, understanding the work that a lot of people are doing out in the world, it was like a fantastic experience. Um, but I do need to say I was not really involved at all with the curatorial process. I was really like just kind of working on the editorial side, right? Which included the catalog, but was not, limited to that. Um, and yeah, that was I mean, it was a super wild process. I started late, and as everyone knows, there's like a ton of projects in there, right? There's basically, 3 to 4 times as many projects as normal. Um, so, you know, there was a
So to understand, one thing to understand is, so you say you weren't only, so you were involved in kind of editorial process across the board. So is that limited to text that we
yeah.
engage with?
So I was the editor of all texts in the exhibition, and the catalog and the short guide, right?
Mhm.
There was an opportunity for me to take a stronger role on the panels along the wall, which Eric Chen described, I think, very elegantly as like a magazine on the walls. But I didn't have the capacity for that. So that would have included more art direction and those things, but no, so I was really just working on the texts. Um, and yeah, it was wild. So yeah, like I said, I started late, or I was brought in late, and there was more than twice as many projects as normal. So I mean, I've done a lot of books in the past, and I'm very glad that I had that kind of experience, because I really needed, under those conditions, I needed to fall back on something that I kind of knew and understood. Let's say a method, a process, a way of organizing material, right? Because, you know, editing, it, it's kind of like data management in a way, right? And especially, with this project, where I needed to deal with, you know, 300 different projects, but I needed two different texts for each project. I needed multiple images and captions and credits for every single project. Um, it just became an enormous amount of volume of data, that needed to be handled. And so actually what my role was in that process, it was probably a bit different than, e-flux, right? Where e-flux, I'm taking pains on every single word. When and the so we commissioned, as part of the catalog, we commissioned around 15 essays, and we conducted a series of these, what's called impossible conversations, which I, led and kind of organized the process behind, together with a couple other people on the team. Um, so, those were things that I felt like I was able to really like engage with, on that kind of minute level. But then there was just a question of like dealing with, a total of basically 600 project descriptions, and images and everything. So yeah, it became this kind of data management, um, uh, process where I had to, um, I had to edit all of the text, and I did. But there wasn't an editorial dialogue in the same way. There wasn't enough time for an editorial dialogue, to have dialogues about relatively short texts with 300 different people. Um, it wasn't fully possible, but what I did feel like I could do, at the very least, was implement some sort of kind of standard, not even necessarily in terms of the quality of the text and the clarity of the text, but just like how things are talked about. So I tried, again, navigating this subtle line between the editor and the author. Like, how do you preserve the author's voice while creating some sort of, let's say, vocal homogeneity amongst the whole? Um, yeah.
Okay, so that's super interesting from the technical point of view, as you've just described. But I guess from another point of view, as you originally said, you immersed yourself in this, like, hundreds of projects. It gave you an insight into practices that maybe you wouldn't be exposed to in normal circumstances. So what did you discover? Like, what did you conclude from that exposure?
Um, I think I'm still trying to figure that out.
Mhm.
It was a very, very, very intense and overwhelming experience at times.
Mhm.
That Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. Beyond the fact of having met an enormous amount more people, you know, having expanded my network in quite kind of dramatic ways, um, and just having a bit more of a deeper understanding of people who are working on in certain areas that are maybe more, let's say, material or technology focused that I also might not otherwise that maybe aren't suitable for me engaging with in other ways, right? That's the thing about like, e-flux and editing. It's like not everyone expresses themselves the best in an essay, right? Some people express themselves best through, a sculpture or an installation or a building. Um, so yeah, it definitely, I you know, Carlo's kind of approach and Claire's and Daniele's and everyone else on the team, they sought to cast a very wide net, but it was also, let's say, conditioned. So I don't have like a comprehensive survey of things, but um so and I think because of that, I don't know if it's entirely fair to
Mhm.
reach like grand conclusions based on that. Right? Like, I don't necessarily think that that gives me an understanding of like where the future of architecture is going.
Oh, no,
I
absolutely.
do think though that it was very interesting. It was not surprising, but it was also very interesting that this is what came after Leslie's Biennale in 2023. Um, and I do think that like there, like a lot of traditional practicing professional architects found a lot more interest or maybe not a lot, but found a good amount more interest in this Biennale. And that was kind of, to me, that was interesting, to be like, where does the kind of the profession of architecture stand within this context, which especially, with Leslie, but also the years before, even with Hashim, seemed to be kind of seemed to kind of drift away from a more conventional understanding of practice. Um, so yeah, it's hard for me to like create totalizing statements or grand conclusions about where we are now. I think, it was very much an experiment that, yeah,
Well, I guess no, no, I totally, I take that point, and I understand. I think it's like a fascinating position to have taken and to have processed all of that. I guess one thing, it maybe goes back to the start of the conversation. It's really interesting that you have these, let's say, institutions like e-flux, university, like you're within a context of an institution in some way, so that situates you, and that's quite helpful. Because
yeah,
then I think that's what allows you to be the editor, because then you have something to edit.
yeah. I mean, actually, when I worked at Volume, what I really appreciate, as frustrating as it was when I was in it, I also really appreciate the fact that space was really created for me to just focus on editing.
Yeah.
Right? Like I didn't have to focus on the economic issues. I didn't have to focus on the distribution issues, right? I could just focus on editing. Um, and of course, like you always seep out of that. But I don't know. I've never really thought about it this way. I'm not sure that's entirely why, but I like working with institutions, right?
Mhm.
Institutions are very particular things. They're like, crystallizations of behavior and habits and ways of working together. And like I find that really interesting. And so um yeah, being able to be involved with the development of e-flux over the past 10 years, and of course not comprehensively, but e-flux architecture, and then kind of occasionally contributing to wider things in the platform, to be able to work on this level at the Rietveld Academy over the past 7, 8 years as it's going through a process of institutional transformation. Like that's been really fun. It's been a and it's been so I don't know. I think independent practice is something, it also goes back to this question of like, what are you if you're not an author, right? Like the relationship between being an author and being an editor. Um, I think a lot of people, like to and like need to be independent. But I think there's different forms of independence, and independent doesn't mean by yourself. Like actually, both of the institutions I work for, e-flux is independent and the Rietveld is independent. It's the only independent art school in the Netherlands, and e-flux is it's self-owned, right? Or it's not self-owned. I mean, it's owned by the owner, but it hasn't been bought by anyone. It's still an independent entity. So I've always prized that. I think that that's a really important thing. But yeah, independence does not mean alone, right? And
Yeah,
so it's
it's
like
not like you're floating in space.
yeah. Yeah,
Um,
I think well, we should be building institutions. We should be building structures that are not entirely dependent on us, and that can also be used by others and take on a life of their own.
yeah, it's both. I guess it goes back to this question of space making, but also like you said, what I thought was really nice. You said how you like to be invited into a space, and I recently was commissioned to write a few things, and I actually every time I really appreciated being. Um, well, in one instance, I was kind of asked, "What would you like to write?" And I actually said, "Well, what would you like me to write?" Like, what do you think from everything, like all these different things I've done recently, like. Actually, I don't mind being invited into a space. And I think that there's also something really nice about saying, oh, yeah, please, like, I want to be in dialogue with you. And therefore, maybe you can start the conversation. Yeah.
In that sense, I mean, for me, the theories of Marcus Meeson were very important, right?
Mm,
His theory of the outsider, right?
mm.
Which I don't know, maybe I actually haven't read his crossbenching book. I think that might be where it's crystallized the most. But yeah, I think I really kind of looked up to him in the way that he positioned himself in relationship to different institutions. Um, there's this idea of an outsider, right? I would say in everything I do, I work with a lot of institutions, but I never let them own me, right? I never let them kind of completely subsume me. I always maintain distance in a way, or I maintain certain boundaries. And that doesn't mean I say like this is what I'm willing to do, this is what I'm not willing to do. It's just I position myself in a way where like there is not total capture.